The storm came down off the high peaks the way bad luck always found Eli Mercer, without warning and without apology. He had been following the old trapper's trail since mid-morning, when the sky was still pale and colorless above the timberline, the clouds sitting flat and distant like they had no business with a man on foot. By noon, they had business with everyone. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in the time it took him to cross a frozen creek bed, and the rain that started as a cold mist became something heavier, something with intent, before he had found any shelter worth the name. The trail, if it had ever really been a trail, disappeared under a slick skin of mud and pine needles. Eli walked on anyway because stopping meant dying, and dying was the one thing he had been successfully avoiding for 20 years, though not always by a comfortable margin. He was thin in the way that comes not from sickness, but from a long season of not quite enough. His canvas jacket was the wrong weight for October in the high country. His boots had been resoled once in Pueblo and were beginning to separate again at the left toe, which let in a cold, thin stream of melt with every step. Over his right shoulder, he carried the bindle, a sun-bleached red flannel shirt knotted around everything he owned in the world. A folding knife, a box of matches in a tobacco tin, half a heel of bread gone stiff, a change of wool socks, and a small photograph of a woman he no longer let himself name. The bindle knocked against his back like a metronome counting down to something. He had been in Leadville until 3 weeks ago. Before that, a sheep ranch outside Salida, where the foreman took a dislike to him on the second day and made a sustained art of it for 6 weeks. Before that, a mining camp at Elevation, where the work was punishing and the pay was an insult, and where the company store had carefully arranged things so that a man ended each month owing slightly more than he had earned. Eli had left that camp at 4 a.m. with what was his and nothing that wasn't, which was a distinction he had always been careful about. He was not a thief. He was not mean. He was not, as best he could tell, a coward. He was simply a young man without connections, without land, without a family name that opened doors, and the world had been explaining to him patiently and consistently, since he was 14, that this combination of lacks was essentially permanent. In Leadville, he had shoveled snow and mucked stables for 11 days before the stable owner's nephew arrived from Denver, needing the work. Eli had been given his wages. He counted them twice, standing in the cold street, and a nod that was neither unkind nor particularly human. He bought 2 meals, some provisions, and a second-hand map of the high country from a drunk who swore it showed a pass into the Gunnison Valley where a man could winter cheaply at a friend's homestead. The drunk had either lied or misremembered. The pass on the map corresponded to nothing Eli had found on the ground, and he had been wandering for 3 days since, working steadily upward along granite ridgelines that grew more remote and less forgiving with every mile. Now the storm was trying to finish what exhaustion and hunger had started. Eli kept moving. The trees up here were old Engelmann spruce, their lower branches dead and gray, their trunks black with rain. The ground between them was broken granite shelved up at odd angles, and he had to watch his footing carefully, because a twisted ankle up here was a death sentence delivered slowly. The cold had moved past uncomfortable into the particular numbness that starts at the extremities and works inward with a kind of bureaucratic thoroughness. His fingers around the bindle strap were not quite his own anymore. He breathed through his nose to warm the air before his lungs had to deal with it. He almost walked past it. He had stopped to rest against a granite face, a long shelf of rock that curved slightly, blocking some of the wind. And he was standing with his forehead against the cold stone and his eyes closed, doing nothing more ambitious than breathing, when he felt it. Warmth. Not imagined warmth, not the desperate warmth a freezing mind invents to comfort itself, but actual warmth, moving against his face in a slow pulse, the way warmth moves through a wall from a room with a fire inside it. He opened his eyes. At first he saw only the rock face, gray and wet and featureless. Then he saw the seam. It was narrow, not much wider than two spread hands placed side by side, running vertically up the granite for perhaps 6 feet before disappearing into an overhang. It might have been a shadow. It might have been a vein of darker mineral, except that from it, in barely visible threads, came steam, thin, pale, intermittent, breathing, and with the steam, unmistakably, came heat. Eli stood very still. He had no framework for this. His experience of rock faces was that they were cold and indifferent and occasionally dangerous. They did not breathe. They did not offer warmth to frozen young men in rainstorms. He was aware, in some distant corner of his mind, that this was either a miracle or a hallucination, and he was currently in no position to prefer the more rational explanation. He pressed his hand flat against the seam. The warmth was real and constant against his palm, rising from somewhere below and inside the mountain, exhaling slowly through the narrow crack like breath from a sleeping animal. Eli looked at the seam for a long time. He looked behind him at the storm, which had not paused to reconsider. Then he put his shoulder to the rock, turned sideways, and pushed himself through. The passage was tight enough that he had to pull the bindle from his shoulder and hold it out ahead of him, reaching blind into the dark with one arm while he shuffled sideways through the crack. The granite pressed against his chest and his shoulder blades simultaneously, and for a bad moment he thought the rock was narrowing and he would be wedged there permanently. A thin cowboy sealed into a mountain like a letter in an envelope. Then the pressure eased, the crack widened, and he stepped through into warmth and darkness and the faint mineral-sweet smell of something ancient and alive. He stood still and let his eyes adjust. The cavern was larger than he'd expected. In the dark, he could not see its ceiling, but the air above him felt open, uncrowded. Ahead and below, perhaps 30 feet away, something gave off a faint phosphorescent glimmer. Not light exactly, but the absence of total darkness, a pale shimmer on moving water. His eyes pulled the shape of things slowly from the black. The rough downward slope of a stone floor, wet in places, dry in others, scattered with old mineral deposits that rose from the ground in low, rounded formations like the knuckles of a buried hand. The ceiling dripped somewhere to his left. The warmth was everywhere, rising from below, and the air was wet with it in a way that felt almost tropical against his storm-frozen face. He moved forward carefully, testing each step before he trusted his weight to it. The mineral deposits were slippery where they caught the dampness from above. He went down the slope slowly, eyes fixed on the faint shimmer below, until the floor leveled, and he stood at the edge of a pool roughly the size of a large room. The hot spring was not violent. It moved with the slow, confident circulation of something with deep origins, its surface barely disturbed, releasing heat in a continuous low exhalation that rose to the cavern ceiling and condensed there, dripping back down in slow musical taps. The glow he had seen came from the minerals deposited at the pool's edges, pale greens and whites, thin enough to catch and hold whatever small light filtered in through the seam above and return it diffused and soft like a lantern seen through a curtain. It was enough to see by. Not comfortably, not clearly, but enough. Eli was crouching at the pool's edge, one hand in the water. Hot, genuinely hot. Not the mild warmth of a sun-warmed creek, but the deep volcanic heat of something that had been traveling up from far below for a very long time. when he looked up and noticed the shack. It stood against the far wall of the cavern, perhaps 50 feet from the pool, built into a natural alcove in the rock that gave it a back wall and half a roof already. The rest of it was man-made, rough-hewn pine boards, darkened with age, fitted together with the rough competence of someone who had known what they were doing and used what they had. A door hung slightly open, on leather hinges. There was a window opening. No glass, no shutter, just a square hole cut in the boards, looking out into the cavern. It was not a fine structure. It was not a structure that would have meant anything in any town. But it was walls. It was a roof. It was shelter inside shelter, warm air inside warm air. And standing in the dark beside a prehistoric hot spring in a mountain nobody had apparently thought worth naming, Eli Mercer looked at it with the quiet vertigo of a man who has just seen the thing he has been trying not to want. He crossed to the shack and pushed the door open fully. The leather hinges protested. Inside, a low wooden platform against the wall that had been a bed, its surface bare. A small iron stove in the corner, its pipe disappearing up through the wooden roof into a crack in the natural stone above. Someone had planned this, had worked out the chimney problem with care and patience. A wooden shelf on the wall with 3 items, a tin cup, a rusted fork, and a stub of tallow candle gone gray with age. A single wooden chair, one leg slightly shorter than the others, propped with a flat stone. That was all. But the stove was solid. The roof, when Eli looked up, was intact. The boards of the walls had swollen with years of damp air and sealed themselves tightly together, the way green wood does when it decides to stay. He sat on the edge of the bed platform and allowed himself to stop moving for the first time in hours. The warmth from the spring reached everything here. Even the walls of the shack were warm to the touch, the stone alcove at the back conducting the deep heat of the earth into the wood. He could feel it through his jacket, through his shirt, working its way into the rigid muscles of his back and shoulders. His hands began to hurt as the blood returned to them, which meant he would keep them. He put his face in his hands and breathed slowly, and did not think about anything for a while. When he was ready to think, he thought practically, which was the only mode that had ever served him. Someone had built this. A long time ago. The tallow candle alone told him that, but deliberately and with skill. They were gone. They had left no sign of violent departure, no abandoned urgency. They had simply left, the way people sometimes left places when the need that brought them there had ended. The stove was functional. The structure was sound. The spring would keep the cavern warm through any winter the mountains could produce. He had matches. He had a knife. He had time now, if he chose to use it. Eli got up, found an old tin box beneath the bed platform, and was not surprised to find inside it a small cache of ancient tallow candles and a handful of rusted but usable nails. He lit the candle stub on the shelf with one careful match. The shack filled with warm yellow light. He sat back down and looked at his hands by it. One night, he told himself. Just one night. He was lying, and he knew it. He woke to the sound of the spring. It was a low, circular sound, not quite a gurgle, not quite a hiss. The sound of water in gentle, constant motion, moving in its slow loop from the earth's interior to the surface of the pool, and back again through some deep, invisible drain. He lay on the bare wood platform and listened to it, and it took him several seconds to remember where he was, which was unusual for a man whose sleep had always been light and location conscious, because the usual reasons for waking carefully, cold, danger, hostile voices, were all absent. What remained instead was warmth and dim soft light, and the mineral smell that had begun to seem less strange and more simply like the smell of the place he was in. He lay still a moment longer than he needed to. Then he got up and inventoried his situation with the blunt honesty that poverty teaches. He had the half heel of bread, now stiff enough to be considered more weapon than food, but edible if he was patient with it. He had 11 matches remaining in the tobacco tin. He had the candle, barely a stub, and the 4 additional candles from the tin beneath the bed, thicker, older, their wicks gray, but they would burn. He had the knife. He had the wool socks. He had now a warm and hidden shelter. What he did not have: food beyond the bread heel, any means of cooking, any blanket or bedding, any way of knowing whether the crack in the granite he'd squeezed through was discoverable from outside by anyone else, and any plan beyond surviving the next day. He ate half the bread slowly, washing it down with water from the spring, which tasted of minerals, sulfur faint at the back of the throat, calcium and iron in the texture of it, but was clean and hot, and filled him more than plain water should have. He would learn over the following weeks that the spring water had properties that plain creek water lacked, that drinking it was different from drinking cold water, that it sat in the stomach with a warmth that lasted, that there was something in its mineral content that kept a lean man functional on less food than he ought to need. But that morning he just drank it because he was thirsty, and felt better than he expected to. After he drank, he worked. He started with the shack itself, because a man with a sound shelter is a man with a foundation, and everything else is built on top of that. He went over every board in the walls carefully, pressing with his palms, looking for soft spots where the wood had begun to rot. He found 3, 2 in the lower wall near the floor, where condensation had gathered over years, and 1 in the door frame. The rot was slow, the wood only punky at the surface, not yet structural. He used the knife to scrape the soft material away, exposing denser wood beneath, and packed the gaps with mineral deposits from the cavern floor, calcium formations that, mixed with water from the spring, dried to something not unlike rough mortar. It would not hold forever, but it would hold. The stove he examined with more care. He opened its iron door and looked inside at the firebox, found it coated with old ash but intact, no cracks in the cast iron, the grate functional. He found old wood, dry and gray with age, stacked in a low pile against the cavern wall, perhaps 30 feet from the shack, half hidden behind a formation of white mineral deposits. Someone had laid in a supply years ago. He took an armful, and then stood with it looking up at the chimney pipe, working out in his mind the draft problem, whether the pipe, after years of disuse, was still clear, and whether the crack in the stone above it led somewhere with enough draw to pull smoke out. He built a small test fire with the driest chips, keeping the shack door open in case the smoke needed somewhere to go. The first curl of gray rose, hit the flue opening, and went up without hesitation. He watched it disappear into the pipe and let out a breath he had been holding. The draft was good, better than good. The crack in the rock above connected to something with pull, possibly a longer fissure that ran toward an exterior opening on the mountain face, and the chimney worked as well as any he had used in a building with real walls and a real roof. He fed the fire carefully, conserving the old wood, and when the stove was warm, he stood with his back to it and felt the heat come through his jacket and thought for the first time in weeks that he was not going to die this season. It was a modest thought. It was the most important thought he had ever had. In the afternoon, he judged time by the slow shift of what thin light came through the entrance seam, though it was imprecise. He explored the cavern properly. It was larger than he had understood in the dark. The main chamber, where the pool sat, was perhaps 80 feet across at its widest point, with the ceiling varying from 15 feet at the edges to considerably higher above the water, where the warmth rose and kept its own climate. There were 2 smaller chambers branching off the main one, a dry alcove to the left of the shack that would serve as storage, its air still and cool without being cold, and a lower chamber to the right, accessible down a natural stone ramp, where a second, smaller pool collected overflow from the main spring in a basin knee-deep and slightly cooler, rinsable and usable for washing. He stood at the edge of the lower pool and looked at his reflection in its still surface. A thin face, dark eyes, a jaw that needed attention, hair that had grown past reasonable. He did not look like a man who had found his future. He looked like a cold, dirty, underfed young man at the bottom of a very long run of bad luck. He would look different, he decided, by spring. On the 4th day, he solved the food problem. He had been rationing the bread heel down to nothing, 2 small pieces on day 2, 1 on day 3, and his stomach had been making its dissatisfaction known in the particular articulate way that hunger communicates when a man is past the first hunger and into the second, which is quieter and more serious. He drank the spring water, and it helped, but water does not negotiate with hunger indefinitely, and on the morning of the 4th day, he accepted that he had to go outside. The storm had passed. He knew this, not from any window, but from the quality of the air in the main chamber, drier than before, less alive with pressure, and from the light at the seam, which when he put his eye to it, showed him a gray but static sky. Clouds settled and still, rather than moving hard and low. He pushed through the crack sideways, emerging onto the mountain face in cold sunlight that hit him like a reprimand after 4 days of cavern warmth. The rock outside was wet, and the ground below the granite shelf was still slick, but the rain and wind were done. He stood outside his mountain for the first time and looked at it with the attention of a man who now had an investment in the place. From the outside, the entrance was effectively invisible. The crack was in the face of a long granite shelf that curved slightly, shadowing the seam from any angle except directly in front of it. And directly in front of it was a steep downslope of broken rock that no one would cross without specific reason. The overhang above it further obscured it in bad weather. Even knowing exactly where it was, standing 20 feet back, Eli had trouble resolving the seam from the natural shadows and variations of the rock face. He felt something he had not allowed himself to feel since he was a child, the satisfaction of a secret that was entirely his own. He spent the day hunting and gathering with the systematic focus of a man who cannot afford failure. He found a stand of timber at the tree line, still holding some dried cones, and spent an hour shaking the dry ones loose into a fold of his jacket. Pine nuts, small and tedious, but caloric and real. He found a seep below the granite shelf where snowmelt collected in a natural basin, and beside it a growth of watercress, cold, stunned, but alive, which he ate on the spot with the unself-conscious hunger of an animal. Higher up, in a sheltered draw, he found sign, deer tracks, 2 days old at least, moving down toward lower elevation. He would need a way to take deer. He had no rifle. He had the knife. He had, when he stopped to think carefully about what he actually had, knowledge. He had spent 2 winters on a ranch in his mid-teens where an old Ute man, working as a hand during the summer season, had talked freely to the boy that Eli was in those years, had shown him, over slow afternoon hours, things about the land that the Anglo cowboys around them were too impatient or too proud to learn. How to read trail sign with enough patience to build a picture in the mind. How to make a snare from green wood and sinew. How to think about where an animal would go when weather changed, where it would shelter and where it would feed. Eli had been a good student because good students are children who understand early that the adults around them hold survival knowledge, and Eli had understood that at a young age. He cut young willow branches at the seep, flexible, strong, and spent 2 hours that afternoon making snares with cordage twisted from plant fiber, setting 3 of them on the deer runs he found in the draw, low to the ground, and positioned where the trail narrowed between rock outcroppings. He set 2 smaller snares near a rock formation where he'd found rabbit sign, pellets, scratch marks, a hollow beneath a boulder that smelled of recent habitation. He went back inside before dark, carrying his pine nuts and the watercress he had wrapped in his extra wool sock to keep clean. He made the fire in the stove and boiled spring water in the tin cup and let the watercress wilt in it, which made something that was technically a soup, and ate it with the pine nuts, and felt his body respond to the calories with a gratitude that was almost embarrassing. He lay on the platform that night with his hands behind his head and did the arithmetic of his situation with the deliberate honesty he brought to all practical questions. He was 4 days into a Colorado October, with winter approaching on a known schedule. He had shelter that would hold and a heat source that cost him nothing. He had snares working. He had matches enough for 3 more weeks of careful use, if the stove's draft was reliable enough to hold a coal overnight. And he had tested this twice now, banking the fire before he slept and waking to find coals that caught new wood without trouble. The cavern's passive warmth meant the stove needed to run only in the mornings and evenings to keep the shack comfortable. He had discovered a dense, dry deposit of old hardwood against the deep cavern wall, more than the original pile he'd found, that someone had laid in years ago, enough to last well into winter if he was not wasteful. What he could not survive without was protein through the winter months and a way to preserve it. The snares were step 1. Step 2 was the stovepipe smoker he had been designing in his mind for 2 days. A secondary box fitted to the flue pipe that would let him smoke meat with the oak wood and the mineral-laced heat of the spring air, which he suspected, correctly as it turned out, would cure meat faster and more completely than smoke alone. Step 3 was everything else. There was a lot of everything else. He welcomed it. For the first time in years, Eli had more ahead of him than behind. By the first hard frost of November, Eli Mercer had built himself a life, not a large life. Not a life that anyone in Leadville or Denver or any town he had drifted through would have recognized as success, but a life in the oldest and most irreducible sense. A place to sleep that was warm and his, food enough to be nourished, work that ended each day with something made or fixed or improved. The shack had been re-chinked along all its walls. The bed platform now had a mattress of pine boughs overlaid with a deer hide. He had taken 3 deer through October, 2 in snares, and 1 with an improvised deadfall that had taken him 5 days to engineer, and had worked on the first try, which he took as a sign of something, though he was not a superstitious man. The hide curing had been rough. He had tanned them with the deer's own brain the way he'd been taught, scraping and working the hides over days. But the result was warm, and his. He had made the smoker. It was inelegant. A secondary chamber of flat stones mortared with mineral paste, fitted to the flue pipe with a fitted stone cap that could be rotated to direct draw, but it worked. He had smoked venison in long strips, dried it further on a rack he'd built of green wood near the pool's warm exhalation, and stored it in the dry alcove in the left chamber, wrapped in birch bark he'd peeled from the dead trees at the timberline. He had enough meat stored to eat protein twice a day through January, with careful management. He had filled the rest of the dry alcove with pine nuts, dried watercress, dried mushrooms. He'd found a late October flush of oyster mushrooms on a dead spruce below the granite shelf and taken all of them, drying them on flat stones near the spring's heat, and 4 clay pots of rendered deer tallow that he used for the candles he'd learned to pour, and for cooking, and for the seams of his boots, where the left toe had finally given up entirely and been resewn with sinew in a repair that would outlast the boot. He had carved. He had nothing else to do in the evenings after the fire was banked and the work of the day was finished, and his knife was good, and the cavern was full of old pine that had dried to a tight, workable grain. He had carved a bowl first, functional, for eating. Then a second bowl. Then, without quite deciding to, a small figure, a horse, standing with its head up. He held it by the stovepipe warmth one evening, and looked at it and thought it was not very good, and then thought that it was the first thing he had ever made that served no purpose except to exist, and that this was a different kind of category than a bowl and worth thinking about. He thought about the previous occupant of the shack often, in the way that a man living alone thinks about the absent figures whose decisions shape his present life. Whoever they were, he had found nothing personal, no name, no dated inscription. They had been competent and patient and had thought carefully about the long term. The stove installation was the work of someone who understood materials and airflow. The wood supply had been chosen for density and laid in with a clear mind for winter arithmetic. The shack itself, wedged into the alcove, used the natural rock to do the work that lumber would otherwise have had to do, cutting the construction problem in half. He was grateful to them the way you are grateful to a teacher you never met. In early November, he made his one trip back to civilization. He needed salt. He needed, badly, a blanket or a second hide. He needed a needle capable of real repair work on his jacket, whose left elbow had torn and been temporarily managed by folded cloth and wishful thinking. And he needed, though he had not admitted it to himself until he was standing at the entrance seam, looking out at the blue, cold morning, to confirm that the world was still there and still indifferent, and that his absence from it had gone as unnoticed as all his previous presence in it had gone. He walked down to a small settlement, more a road junction with pretensions, called Garnet Crossing, 8 miles below the granite shelf along a route he had scouted carefully. He had with him 2 things of value: a cured deer hide, smooth side out, and a dozen pine nut pine tar tallow candles he had poured into lengths of hollow reed. The hide he traded at a general store, run by a large woman with quick eyes, who asked no questions and gave him fair value in salt, a wool blanket of adequate thickness, and 2 large-eyed needles with a spool of heavy thread. The candles he sold to the same woman for 30 cents, which she offered without being asked, turning one over in her hands and smelling the tallow thoughtfully. "These are unusual," she said. "Spring mineral in the tallow," Eli said, which was true and explained nothing. "You got more?" He looked at her. "Maybe come spring." He bought hard cheese and dried beans with 20 cents of the candle money, and kept 10 cents back because a man should have 10 cents. He spoke to no one else in Garnet Crossing, which required no effort since no one spoke to him. A thin young man with a red bindle was not an event in a road junction in 1881. He was furniture. He was weather. He walked back up through the cold afternoon, found the seam in the granite as easily as finding a door he had been using for years, and pushed through into warmth and his own quiet. He hung the wool blanket on a peg he'd carved into the shack wall and stood back and looked at it hanging there. Blue wool against dark pine board, a smear of color in the cavern's mineral light, and felt something he had no ready name for, a feeling that was too large for the object that had caused it, the feeling of a man who is building a world from almost nothing, one small, true thing at a time. Outside, The first real snow of winter was beginning to fall on the mountain. Inside, the spring breathed on, warm and patient, and entirely his.